My brother laughed in my face and told me I could not even afford a reliable car. He had no idea what was coming. When the massive corporate helicopter touched down on our pristine family lawn and shattered my mother's antique teacups into 100 pieces, I simply smiled. My name is Autumn Davis. I am exactly 33 years old, and somehow I am still healing from the deep emotional wounds my family inflicted upon me. As the founder and chief executive officer of a highly successful cybersecurity firm, I managed to escape their toxic environment years ago. However, I always kept my immense wealth a closely guarded secret. Last Tuesday, they summoned me to our childhood home for what they described as an urgent and mandatory family meeting. Between sips of expensive champagne and condescending glares, they showed me exactly who they were. I simply sat there, absorbed their cruelty, and prepared to dismantle their entire world. Growing up in Greenwich, Connecticut, meant absolute privilege to the outside world. But inside our sprawling colonial estate, a distinct emotional coldness permeated every single corner. Our massive home, with its perfectly manicured lawns, towering oak trees, and heated swimming pool, was a sprawling fortress of rigid expectations that I could never quite meet. My parents, Gregory and Beatrice, viewed children as business investments. If you yielded a high social return, you were rewarded. If you chose a different path, you were discarded. My older brother Harrison was their ultimate prize. At 36 years old, he was the golden child who could do no wrong. He wore expensive custom suits, spoke with a loud, demanding authority, and ran a prestigious venture capital firm that my parents proudly bragged about at every single country club dinner they attended. I, on the other hand, was the family disappointment. I preferred writing code in my room to attending high society galas. When I declined my acceptance to a prestigious medical school to pursue software development, my parents treated it as a personal betrayal. They withdrew all their support and told me I was ruining my life. I arrived at the estate precisely at 10 in the morning. The heavy oak doors of the house felt intimidating, a physical reminder of the heavy judgment that always awaited me inside. I was directed by the housekeeper to the main library. It was a suffocating mahogany-paneled room that smelled of expensive cigar smoke and old paper. My parents and my brother were already waiting for me. They sat arranged in a semicircle, presenting a united front. Gregory sat behind his massive desk, his face arranged in a stern, unyielding expression. Beatrice lounged on a velvet sofa, holding a crystal glass filled with a morning mimosa. Harrison stood near the fireplace, vibrating with a nervous, aggressive energy that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I sat on a rigid antique chair across from them. I wore a plain, unbranded cashmere sweater and dark jeans. I knew my lack of designer labels would immediately be judged, and I could already see my mother eyeing my outfit with clear disdain. I slowly poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the silver pitcher on the table beside me. The ice cubes clinked against the crystal, sounding abnormally loud in the quiet room. The air in the library was heavy with a thick, suffocating, and incredibly uncomfortable silence. No one asked how my morning was going. No one offered a warm or polite greeting. We simply sat in the quiet tension that defined every interaction I had with my family. Then, without any warning, Harrison lunged forward. He moved with a sudden, violent swiftness that made me flinch. He tossed a thick, heavy stack of legal documents directly onto my lap. The sheer force of his movement knocked my arm. My glass of sparkling water tipped over, spilling icy liquid all over the polished wood table and splashing onto my jeans. The cold water seeped through my clothes, chilling my skin, but Harrison did not even blink. He did not offer a towel or an apology. He simply glared down at me. "Sign the guarantor release, Autumn," he demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet library. I looked down at the massive stack of paper resting heavily on my legs. The top page was filled with dense legal jargon and banking terms. I slowly looked up at my brother, trying to keep my breathing steady. "What is this, Harrison?" "My venture capital firm needs a $5 million bridge loan by noon today," he said, pacing back and forth across the Persian rug. "The bank is requiring an additional family guarantor to secure the equity pledge. Since you just scraped by as a freelance coder, putting your signature on this document is the least you can do to pay this family back for raising you." He was asking me to take on $5 million of legal liability for his business, and he was framing it as an obligation. He spoke to me as if I owed him a massive debt simply for existing. He looked at me not as a sister, but as a convenient tool to solve his financial problems. Beatrice let out a long, dramatic sigh from the velvet sofa. The sound was designed to convey exactly how much of a burden she found my hesitation to be. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her mimosa. Then she opened her designer purse, pulled out her checkbook, and quickly scribbled something down. The scratching of her pen was sharp and aggressive. She tossed the paper onto the desk. "Do not be stubborn, Autumn," my mother said, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness and deep condescension. "Take this check for your groceries. It is for $500. You have been a continuous financial embarrassment to this family ever since you selfishly refused to go to medical school. We have had to watch you struggle with your little computer hobbies while your brother actually builds a legacy. Just sign the paper so Harrison can secure his funding and we can all move on with our day." I looked at the $500 check resting on the dark wood. It was a perfectly orchestrated, deliberate insult designed to hurt me. She genuinely believed that $500 was a massive, life-changing amount of money for someone in my position. She thought I was so desperate, so broken, and so poor that I would gladly sign away my financial future just to fill my refrigerator. The unfairness of the situation settled over me like a heavy blanket. They had provided absolutely no emotional or financial support when I was building my life from the ground up. Yet here they were demanding that I risk everything to save the golden child who had clearly mismanaged his own company. I did not reach for the pen Harrison was holding out to me. I did not touch the check my mother had thrown like a bone to a stray dog. Instead, I carefully lifted the heavy stack of legal documents from my lap and placed them gently onto the desk. The water from my spilled glass was still dripping onto the floor, a steady, rhythmic sound that emphasized the tension in the room. I looked at my brother's desperate, angry face. I looked at my mother's smug, expectant smile. I looked at my father, who sat in silent approval of their behavior. They thought they held all the power. They thought they had cornered the weak, helpless daughter who would easily fold under their pressure. But they had no idea who was actually sitting right in that chair. They had no idea that the quiet girl they had dismissed as a failure had spent the last decade building an empire that dwarfed their entire family legacy. The anger inside me began to cool into a sharp, focused clarity. I was completely done being their scapegoat. The time for staying silent and keeping the peace had officially ended. I kept my hands perfectly still in my lap, letting the silence stretch out and fill the oppressive space of the library. Harrison stood over me, his hand still outstretched, holding a heavy gold fountain pen. The polished metal caught the dim light from the chandelier above, reflecting a sharp glare that matched the intensity in his eyes. He expected me to snatch the pen, scribble my name, and retreat back into the shadows of my quiet life. My mother expected me to snatch her meager check and grovel for her charity. Instead, I ignored both the pen and the check. I slowly reached down and picked up the thick stack of legal documents resting on my lap. The pages felt heavy and significant. I adjusted my posture in the rigid antique chair, resting the paperwork against the edge of the polished mahogany table, right next to the puddle of spilled sparkling water. I turned to the first page and began to read. I did not skim the bold headings or flip aimlessly through the pages. I read the fine print. I read the liability clauses, the asset declarations, and the specific terms of the bridge loan. Harrison let out a loud, theatrical groan of frustration. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the Persian rug. He crossed his arms over his chest and glared down at me. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing, reminding me again that he was on a strict timeline and that the bank needed the paperwork returned before noon. I did not look up from the pages. I simply turned to the next sheet, letting my eyes trace the complex legal jargon that detailed exactly how much financial ruin he was trying to dump onto my shoulders. Beatrice let out another dramatic sigh from the velvet sofa, muttering something under her breath about my endless need for attention and my complete lack of respect for my brother's valuable time. I ignored her entirely. I kept turning the pages, moving past the asset declarations and the collateral agreements. Then I reached the final section of the preliminary filings. My eyes locked onto the bottom of the page, and my breath hitched just for a fraction of a second. There, on the line designated for the secondary guarantor, was my name. It was signed in dark blue ink. The handwriting was a surprisingly decent imitation of my own signature, capturing the slight slant of the letters and the specific loop of the first initial. However, I knew immediately that I had never held a pen to this paper. I stared blankly at the dark blue ink, letting the harsh, unforgiving reality of the entire situation wash over me in a slow, suffocating wave. They had not just brought me here to bully me into signing a loan. They had already committed a major federal crime behind my back, and they desperately needed my final official signature today to legally legitimize the massive financial fraud they had already set into motion without my consent. I felt a strange, icy calm settle deep inside my chest. The anger was still there, but it was no longer the chaotic, desperate anger of an unloved child. It was the sharp, focused anger of a woman who fully understood the game being played. I slowly lifted my head and looked directly into my brother's eyes. I kept my voice dangerously calm, ensuring that every single word carried the heavy weight of a threat. I asked him if he had actually forged my signature on federal bank documents just to cover the massive, embarrassing losses of his failing venture capital firm. Harrison visibly flinched. The aggressive, demanding posture he had maintained all morning suddenly collapsed. His face drained of color, turning a sickly pale shade of gray in the dim light of the library. He took a quick, involuntary step backward, his polished leather shoes scraping loudly against the intricate patterns of the rug. He looked frantically toward our father across the room, his eyes wide with a sudden, desperate, and overwhelming sense of panic that he could no longer hide from me. He had expected me to blindly sign the final page without looking at the rest of the packet. He had severely underestimated me, just as he had done for my entire life. But before Harrison could even attempt to formulate a believable lie or stumble through a truly pathetic excuse, Gregory stepped in quickly to fiercely protect his precious golden child. My father pushed his heavy leather desk chair back with a loud, aggressive scrape and stood up to his full height. He slammed both of his hands down onto the surface of the mahogany desk, the sheer force of the impact causing my mother's cheek to flutter slightly. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He completely ignored the fact that his son had just been caught committing a serious felony. Instead, he pointed a rigid, trembling finger directly at my face. He angrily demanded to know how I dared to speak to my brother in such a disrespectful and accusatory tone. His voice boomed through the library, loud and commanding, designed to intimidate me back into submission. He glared at me with absolute contempt and stated proudly that they had signed my name themselves. He admitted to the forgery without a single ounce of shame or hesitation, brushing it off as if it were nothing more than a minor administrative detail. My father leaned heavily over the massive desk, his eyes burning with a harsh, judgmental light. He told me that signing my name on the preliminary bank filings was a mere formality, a simple necessity to keep the business moving forward while they waited for me to arrive. He showed absolutely no remorse for stealing my identity or risking my financial future. He then laid out the brutal reality of their plan. He told me that if I did not pick up the pen and sign the final, binding documents before noon today, the bank would immediately launch a full audit into Harrison's venture capital firm. He sneered at my simple clothes and my quiet life, stating that I had absolutely no reputation to ruin. Harrison, he declared, was a respected pillar of the financial community, a man whose public image and career had to be protected at all costs. My mother nodded vigorously from the sofa, taking another sip of her mimosa in quiet agreement. My father took a deep breath and delivered his final devastating threat. He looked me straight in the eyes and promised that if the bank discovered the forged documents and decided to investigate the fraud, they would falsely claim that I had signed the papers myself, that I was a bitter, struggling freelancer trying to sabotage my successful brother. They were entirely willing to sacrifice my freedom and my future just to shield Harrison from the natural consequences of his own disastrous business decisions. The absolute weight of this betrayal hung heavy in the stale air of the library. My own parents had just verbally promised to hand me over to federal authorities to save the son they actually loved. I sat perfectly still in the antique chair holding the forged documents in my hands, completely absorbing the sheer magnitude of their cruelty and preparing to unleash the absolute ruin they so desperately deserved. The air in the library felt heavy, completely devoid of familial affection. I did not move a single muscle, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch under their combined scrutiny. Harrison, mistaking my stony silence for fear, took that opportunity to press his advantage. He stepped away from the fireplace, his leather shoes making sharp, aggressive sounds against the antique rug. He walked directly toward me, closing the distance with a swaggering, confident stride that he had spent years perfecting in corporate boardrooms. He stopped in front of my chair, invading my personal space to physically intimidate me. He loomed over me, casting a dark, heavy shadow across the forged legal documents that still rested quietly on my lap. He planted his hands on his hips, pushing back his suit jacket to display the expensive designer belt and gold watch our parents bought for his 30th birthday. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to feel entirely insignificant and powerless beneath his towering presence. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, staring directly at the silver buttons on his suit jacket. I could smell his overpowering cologne, a sharp, spicy scent that always preceded his arrogant demands. He leaned forward slightly, closing the gap even further, trying to force me to lean back into the antique chair. I held my ground, keeping my spine perfectly straight and my breathing completely even and controlled. When physical intimidation failed to produce the terrified reaction he sought, Harrison resorted to his favorite weapon. He opened his mouth and began to attack my character, my choices, and my lack of financial success. He let out a short, harsh bark of laughter, a sound completely devoid of humor. He pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest, specifically gesturing toward the plain, unbranded black cashmere sweater I had chosen to wear this morning. He mocked the simplicity of my clothing, sneering at the lack of a designer logo. He told me that my wardrobe was a pathetic reflection of my failing career and lack of ambition. He mocked my independent lifestyle, claiming that I had wasted my entire adult life writing code in cramped apartments while he built a massive financial empire. He spoke with a dripping, venomous condescension that filled the library, bouncing off the walls and the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. I did not stop at insulting my clothes. He moved on to my transportation, his voice growing louder and more aggressive with every single word. He crossed his arms over his chest again and glared down at me with absolute contempt. He brought up my arrival at the estate earlier that morning, speaking as if he possessed some secret, humiliating knowledge about my personal life. He loudly announced to the room that the estate security guard had seen me arrive in a standard, commercial rideshare vehicle. He laughed mockingly, stating that my old beat-up sedan must have finally died and broken down completely, leaving me entirely dependent on cheap public transit. He painted a pathetic picture of a struggling, desperate sister who could not even afford a reliable vehicle to drive to her own family home. He used this fabricated narrative to bolster his own sense of superiority, ensuring that our parents heard every single insulting detail. Beatrice let out a soft, approving chuckle from the velvet sofa, thoroughly enjoying the verbal assault being launched against me. Gregory nodded in silent agreement from behind his massive mahogany desk, clearly pleased that his golden son was putting me back in my proper subservient place. They formed a united, impenetrable wall of judgment and disdain, completely certain that I was nothing more than a broken, impoverished failure who should be incredibly grateful for their scraps of attention. Harrison took another step closer, his face turning slightly red with aggressive energy. He looked down at the thick stack of bank documents resting on my lap, the very same documents containing my forged signature. He rolled his eyes and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. He pointed at the complex legal jargon printed on the pages and told me to stop wasting his valuable time. He stated firmly that I did not know the very first thing about high-level finance, venture capital, or commercial banking structures. He demanded that I stop pretending to read the contract, insisting that the legal terms and financial obligations were completely beyond my basic comprehension. He ordered me to just pick up the gold fountain pen and sign the final page, treating me like an ignorant child. who needed to be blindly guided by her wealthy, successful older brother. I believed his own lies so completely. He genuinely thought I was sitting there in stunned, confused silence because I could not understand the paperwork. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last decade mastering the exact financial systems he was currently failing to navigate. He did not know that the quiet, supposedly broke sister sitting in front of him had built a massive, globally recognized technology firm from the ground up. He did not know that I understood the legal implications of that forged document far better than he ever would. I let his insults hang in the stale air of the library for a long, heavy moment. I let him bask in his false sense of victory. I allowed him to believe just for a few seconds longer that his intimidation tactics had worked perfectly and that I was about to surrender to his demands. Then I slowly looked up from his silver suit buttons and met his eyes directly. I did not flinch, and I did not look away. I felt a cold, detached smile form on my lips. It was not a smile of joy or amusement. It was the sharp, predatory smile of a woman who had just trapped her abuser in a corner with absolutely no way out. The sudden shift in my demeanor caught Harrison entirely off guard. The arrogant, demanding expression on his face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of genuine confusion. He had expected tears, apologies, or fearful submission. He had not expected me to smile at him with such chilling, absolute confidence. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of emotion. I did not raise my voice to match his yelling. I spoke with a quiet, undeniable authority that immediately commanded the entire room. I addressed his insulting assumptions one by one, carefully dismantling the pathetic false narrative he had constructed about my life. I looked directly into his increasingly panicked eyes. I took a ride share to the gate because I didn't want my driver ruining the suspension on your poorly paved driveway, I said, letting the words hang in the air. Harrison blinked, taking a small, uncertain step backward. He opened his mouth to speak, to perhaps accuse me of lying or being delusional, but I did not give him the chance to interrupt me. I immediately moved on to his next insult, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow. I tapped the screen of my smartphone, lighting it up. And I know about finance because the bank you're applying to, Sterling Financial, just flagged this exact application for asset inflation, I told him, keeping my cold, detached smile firmly in place. I sat back in my chair, holding my phone loosely in my hand, and watched the devastating reality of my words crash down upon my brother and my parents. Before I could even open my mouth to respond to my father's disgusting ultimatum, the heavy oak doors of the library flew open with a violent crash. The thick wood hit the wall so hard that the framed oil paintings shuddered. Bianca, the wife of my older brother, marched into the room like a hurricane of entitlement. She was dressed immaculately in a pristine white pantsuit that probably cost more than the average person made in a month. Her blonde hair was styled into perfect waves, and her wrists were stacked heavily with gold bracelets that clinked loudly with every aggressive movement. Bianca had always viewed me with deep suspicion, entirely convinced that my quiet, unassuming nature was a personal insult to her flashy lifestyle. She strutted past my mother on the velvet sofa, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She did not even bother to assess the tension in the room. She simply locked her furious, cold blue eyes directly onto me. In her perfectly manicured hand, she gripped a crumpled designer shopping bag. Without a single word of greeting, she reared back and threw the heavy paper bag directly at my feet. It landed with a dull thud against the toe of my practical boots, the thick rope handles splaying out across the intricate carpet. I looked down at the discarded bag, then slowly raised my eyes back up to meet her glare. She pointed a finger right at my face, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed painfully off the mahogany walls. She screamed that I was actively trying to ruin her husband simply because I was consumed by bitter jealousy. She stood there vibrating with manufactured outrage and loudly declared that my actions were driven entirely by the fact that I was 33 years old, perpetually single, and completely broke. She spat the word broke as if it were a contagious disease. According to her deeply flawed logic, my refusal to blindly sign a forged bank document was not an act of self-preservation, but a malicious attempt to destroy the glamorous life she felt she was fundamentally owed. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, stepping closer to Harrison to shield him from my supposed villainy. Harrison adopted the role of the exhausted victim, placing a hand on his wife's waist and sighing heavily, acting as though he was just trying to keep the peace. Bianca leaned forward, her eyes flashing with a toxic pride. She proudly announced to the entire room that Harrison had just purchased a breathtaking $150,000 summer timeshare for her in an exclusive coastal enclave. She bragged about the luxury and the sheer expense of the gift, using the massive price tag to emphasize exactly how successful her husband was compared to me. She then accused me of deliberately trying to sabotage his crucial venture capital loan out of pure spite, claiming I simply could not handle seeing them thrive while I rotted away in poverty. She genuinely believed my hesitation in the library was an attempt to block her access to summer vacations. The sheer delusion of her accusations was dizzying. She had absolutely no idea that the man she was fiercely defending was currently standing inches away from federal wire fraud charges, or that the loan he was begging for was a desperate attempt to plug a bleeding hole in his failing company. I remained completely silent, letting her shrill accusations hang in the stale air of the library. My stillness only seemed to infuriate her further. Since her insults about my relationship status and my bank account failed to provoke the emotional breakdown she so desperately wanted, Bianca decided to dig deeper. She decided to weaponize the most painful defining betrayal of my entire adult life. A malicious, ugly laugh erupted from her throat. It was a cold, cruel sound that completely stripped away any remaining facade of polite family dynamics. She looked down her nose at me and stated that my behavior today was exactly like the dramatic stunt I had pulled 5 years ago. She was referring to the time I had rightfully claimed that Harrison had stolen the foundational application code I had spent 2 years developing from scratch. Hearing her bring up that specific trauma in such a callous, mocking tone felt like a physical blow, but I refused to let it show on my face. 5 years ago, I trusted my brother with the early beta version of a revolutionary software architecture I was building. Instead of helping me secure a patent, as he had promised, he legally registered the intellectual property under his own newly formed company. When I discovered the theft and brought it to our parents, demanding justice and the return of my life's work, the family united against me. They called me paranoid and greedy. They protected his theft because they believed his polished business degree made him a far better candidate to bring the product to market. Bianca continued her verbal assault, enjoying the opportunity to twist the knife. She reminded me loudly that nobody in the family had believed my accusations back then. She smiled a nasty, victorious smile, her eyes glittering with spite. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper that cut through the silence of the room. She told me that since nobody believed me when I claimed he stole my code, absolutely nobody was going to believe a washed-up, delusional nerd now when I claimed he was committing bank fraud. She laid out the entire family dynamic in one brutal sentence. In their world, truth was entirely dictated by status, wealth, and popularity. Harrison had the expensive suits, the charming smile, and the loud, aggressive confidence, which meant his version of reality would always be accepted as the absolute truth. I, with my quiet demeanor and simple clothes, would always be cast as the jealous, lying failure. She stood there completely satisfied with her vicious monologue, eagerly waiting for me to shatter. My father watched from behind his massive desk, making no move to stop his daughter-in-law from verbally abusing me. My mother took another slow sip of her morning mimosa, seemingly bored by the entire display, but implicitly supporting every cruel word. Bianca spat in my direction. They were all complicit. They were all active participants in a coordinated effort to break my spirit and force my compliance. Bianca nudged the crumpled designer shopping bag with the toe of her expensive stiletto, a final physical gesture of her immense disrespect. She demanded that I stop trying to ruin their perfect lives. Stop holding up the bridge loan and just sign the paperwork so they could go back to enjoying the wealth and status they believed they inherently deserved. She thought she had delivered the ultimate insult. She thought she had firmly put me back in my place by reminding me of the worst defeat of my life. What Bianca failed to realize, however, was that the theft of my code 5 years ago had not broken me. It had forged me into something indestructible. It taught me exactly how ruthless the business world could be, and never to trust my family with my ideas, my finances, or my heart ever again. Her malicious laughter did not hurt me today. It simply provided the final necessary confirmation that I owed these people absolutely nothing. I let the echoes of Bianca's malicious laughter fade into the heavy silence of the mahogany library. I did not flinch, I did not cry, and I certainly did not offer the desperate apologies she was eagerly anticipating. Instead, I slowly reached down into my simple, unbranded leather tote bag resting beside my chair. Harrison and Bianca watched me with narrowed eyes, assuming I was reaching for a tissue to wipe away my tears, or pulling out a pen to sign my own financial death warrant. My mother leaned forward on the velvet sofa, waiting for my inevitable surrender. I pulled out a sleek, ultra-thin tablet, its dark screen reflecting the warm light of the crystal chandelier above us. I spoke with a quiet, devastating certainty that instantly commanded the room. I looked directly at my sister-in-law, watching the smug satisfaction still resting on her perfectly contoured face. I told Bianca that she was operating under a massive, humiliating delusion. I calmly informed her that Harrison had not actually purchased a $150,000 summer timeshare for her. I watched her perfectly manicured eyebrows furrow in sudden confusion as I explained the harsh, undeniable reality of her glamorous lifestyle. I told her that the luxurious coastal property she had been bragging about to all of her wealthy friends was merely leased. I explained that her husband had hidden the lease under a convoluted shell company, and that specific company was currently 90 days past due on its payments. I let that piece of information settle over her, watching the arrogant pride slowly drain away, replaced by a creeping, horrifying realization that her perfect marriage was built on a crumbling foundation of debt and lies. Bianca turned her head sharply to look at Harrison, seeking immediate reassurance, but my brother refused to meet her eyes. His face was pale, his jaw clenched so tightly I could see a small muscle ticking frantically in his cheek. The absolute silence from the golden child was a far more damning confirmation than anything I could have ever said. Before Bianca could scream another baseless accusation, I smoothly shifted my focus back to Harrison. I addressed the deeply painful history she had just weaponized against me. I spoke about the foundational application code he had stolen from me 5 years ago. The very same intellectual property this family had allowed him to legally register under his own name. I did not speak with the frantic, helpless desperation I had used back then. I spoke with the clinical, detached precision of a seasoned chief executive officer dissecting a failed competitor. I reminded him that he had forcefully taken my work, but he had entirely failed to understand the complex architecture behind it. I stated clearly and confidently that because he lacked the actual talent to sustain the platform, he had completely bankrupted that stolen application in less than 6 months. He had taken my brilliant idea and driven it straight into the ground. I paused, letting the absolute truth of his monumental business failure echo through the library. Then, I revealed the secret I had been fiercely guarding for half a decade. I told them that while they were busy celebrating his stolen achievements, I had quietly sat down and rebuilt the entire architecture from scratch. I explained that I had not just recreated the original code, but I had fundamentally improved it, evolving it into a massive, impenetrable digital infrastructure. I announced to the silent, suffocating room that I had used that new architecture to found a company called Apex Cybernetics. I watched the complete lack of comprehension wash over my parents' faces. They were so deeply conditioned to view me as a pathetic, struggling freelancer that they could not immediately process the sheer magnitude of the words leaving my mouth. They thought I was simply making up a desperate lie to save face in front of Bianca. They needed undeniable visual proof. I tapped the screen of my tablet, waking the device from its sleep mode. I opened the primary financial dashboard I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I slowly turned the tablet around, holding it up, so the bright glowing screen was perfectly visible to every single person in the room. I showed them the live active stock tickers displaying the current trading value of Apex Cybernetics. I showed them the undeniable proof that my company had officially gone public just last month. Right in the center of the screen, displayed in high definition, was the digital cover of a highly respected, globally recognized financial magazine. The bold, undeniable headline praised the revolutionary impact of Apex Cybernetics on the global technology sector. Positioned directly beneath that headline was a high-quality professional photograph of my face. I was staring back at them from the screen, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit projecting absolute power and undeniable success. The visual evidence was completely irrefutable. I was not a struggling freelancer begging for their approval. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a publicly traded technology empire. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely chaotic. The family stared at the glowing screen in a state of absolute paralyzed shock. Harrison stared at the stock tickers, his eyes widening in pure terror as his brain desperately tried to calculate the astronomical wealth currently resting in my hands. His entire identity was built on being the most successful person in the room, and I had just completely obliterated that illusion. Bianca let out a small, strangled gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she stared at the magazine cover featuring the sister-in-law she had just viciously mocked. My father remained completely frozen behind his desk, his mouth slightly open, entirely unable to reconcile the powerful executive on the screen with the daughter he had spent 33 years aggressively dismissing. The silence stretched until it felt like the very walls of the library were closing in around us. Then the shock shattered, instantly replaced by a frantic, desperate denial. Beatrice could not handle the reality of my success. It completely destroyed her carefully constructed worldview. She set her mimosa down on the coffee table with a loud, aggressive clatter. She lunged forward from the velvet sofa, her face twisted into a mask of ugly, terrified rage. She reached across the open space and aggressively snatched the tablet right out of my hands. She slammed it face down onto the polished mahogany desk, as if hiding the screen could magically erase the truth of my accomplishments. She glared at me, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. She screamed that fake websites and manufactured magazine covers would not save me from a massive, ruinous lawsuit. Gregory immediately seized upon her denial, using it to fuel his own aggressive retaliation. The reality of my wealth was too threatening to his authority. He immediately pulled out his own smartphone. His hands were shaking slightly, betraying the deep underlying panic he was desperately trying to hide. He pointed a rigid finger at me, his voice booming through the library with a harsh, authoritarian tone. He announced that he was calling the local police chief right this second. He threatened to have me forcibly escorted off the family property by armed officers. He stated loudly and clearly that he was going to have me arrested and formally charged with corporate espionage and attempting to extort my own brother. Gregory held his smartphone with a white-knuckled grip, his thumb jabbing aggressively at the screen as he scrolled through his extensive list of high-powered contacts. He was not making an empty theatrical threat designed merely to frighten me. He fully intended to use his considerable wealth and deep community influence to destroy my life. He found the contact he was looking for and pressed the call button, bringing the phone up to his ear with a sharp, decisive movement. I sat in my chair and watched my own father dial the personal cell phone number of the local police chief, a man who had attended countless summer barbecues and holiday parties at this very estate. The sheer speed at which Gregory escalated the situation to involve law enforcement revealed the absolute depths of his panic. He could not control me with financial threats anymore, so he was resorting to state-sanctioned force. The library was so quiet I could hear the faint ringing tone emanating from the speaker of his phone. Beatrice watched him with wide, expectant eyes, her hands nervously smoothing the fabric of her designer trousers. Bianca stood slightly behind Harrison, her arms crossed defensively, a triumphant smirk beginning to form on her lips. They all genuinely believed that the mere mention of the police would finally break my resolve. They expected me to panic, to stand up and beg for mercy, to offer my signature in exchange for my freedom. I simply remained seated, keeping my breathing slow and measured, observing them, as if they were a fascinating, predictable psychological experiment. The call connected. Gregory immediately launched into a frantic, highly embellished narrative. His voice dropped into a low, serious tone, perfectly calibrated to convey the image of a deeply concerned, upstanding citizen who was currently being victimized. He greeted the police chief by his first name, effortlessly utilizing decades of manufactured friendship. He explained that a deeply disturbed estranged family member had trespassed onto the estate and was currently making severe, unfounded threats against his son's business. He requested that officers be dispatched to the property immediately to handle what he described as a highly volatile and potentially dangerous situation. He used words like unstable, aggressive, and extortion. He painted a masterful, terrifying picture of a deranged daughter who needed to be physically removed and locked away for the safety of his innocent family. He ended the call with a curt expression of gratitude and slipped the phone back into the breast pocket of his tailored suit. He looked down at me, his chest puffed out with a restored sense of authoritarian power. He proudly announced that a patrol car would be arriving at the front gate in less than 10 minutes. He stated that I had pushed my luck entirely too far and that I was about to face the severe, uncompromising consequences of disrespecting this family. Harrison, deeply emboldened by our father's aggressive action, decided to ensure that I could not escape before the authorities arrived. He turned away from the center of the room and marched directly toward the entrance of the library. The heavy solid oak double doors were currently pushed wide open, leading out into the grand marble-floored hallway of the main house. Harrison grabbed the brass handles and pulled the heavy doors shut with a loud, echoing slam that vibrated through the floorboards. He reached down and firmly turned the heavy brass deadbolt, locking us inside the room. Then he deliberately positioned his tall, broad frame directly in front of the exit. He crossed his arms over his chest and planted his feet shoulder-width apart, effectively transforming his body into a physical barricade. The atmosphere in the room instantly shifted from a tense negotiation to a hostile, claustrophobic confinement. The air felt stagnant and heavy. I was now locked inside a soundproof room with 3 people who actively despised me, and 1 woman who was practically vibrating with malicious glee. Harrison glared at me from across the room, his eyes dark with a terrifying, unpredictable anger. The polished veneer of the successful venture capitalist had completely melted away, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, cornered predator who was willing to do absolutely anything to survive. He pointed a rigid finger at me, his voice dropping to a harsh, dangerous growl that commanded the entire space. He told me that I was not leaving this room. He stated with absolute terrifying conviction that I was not walking out of those oak doors until I picked up the gold fountain pen and signed the final page of the guarantor release form. He completely discarded any pretense of asking for a favor. This was a direct, unapologetic demand, backed by the implicit threat of physical force. I took a few slow, menacing steps forward, leaving the door, but remaining positioned between me and the only exit. He wanted to make sure I felt entirely trapped. He leaned his head forward, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He promised me that if I did not comply with his demands, right this second, he would make it his personal mission to completely obliterate my life. He swore that he would use every single resource at his disposal, every connection he had ever made, and every dollar in his bank account to drag my name through the mud. He threatened to ruin whatever pathetic, insignificant little life I had somehow managed to scrape together over the past 10 years. He vowed to bury me in endless, crushing litigation until I was completely bankrupt, homeless, and entirely broken. He stood there, chest heaving with aggressive, terrified energy, waiting for me to shatter. He expected the locked doors and the impending arrival of the police to finally push me over the edge into total, absolute submission. I did not break character. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up. And I certainly did not display even a single ounce of the fear he was so desperately trying to provoke. I remained perfectly unsettlingly composed. I let his vicious threats hang in the stale air, allowing the sheer, undeniable reality of his criminal behavior to fully solidify in the room. He had just locked me inside a room against my will. I had just threatened to destroy my life if I did not sign a document that he had already fraudulently altered. He was handing me the exact ammunition I needed to completely destroy him, and he was too blinded by his own arrogant panic to even realize it. I slowly raised my left arm, resting my wrist delicately on the polished edge of the mahogany table. I wore a sleek, high-tech smartwatch that blended perfectly with my simple, unbranded clothing. The dark screen of the watch was currently blank, but a tiny, almost imperceptible green light was blinking steadily on the side of the metal casing. I reached over with my right hand and deliberately pressed a small button on the side of the watch face. The green light immediately stopped blinking and turned solid red, indicating that a specific action had just been successfully completed and securely transmitted. I lowered my hands back to my lap and looked directly into my father's eyes, bypassing Harrison entirely. The cold, detached smile returned to my face, sharper and more dangerous than before. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring that my words cut through the tension with absolute devastating clarity. I looked at Gregory and thanked him. I thanked him sincerely and politely for the clear, undeniable verbal confirmation of false imprisonment and ongoing coordinated federal bank fraud. I watched his brow furrow in sudden deep confusion as the words slowly registered in his mind. I explained to him, speaking slowly, as if addressing a particularly slow child, that my legal team was currently listening to everything happening in this room. I informed him that the dedicated security and legal division of Apex Cybernetics had just successfully logged the entire unedited audio recording of this entire meeting directly into a secure encrypted server. I let my gaze slowly sweep across the room, taking in the sudden horrifying realization dawning on all of their faces. I told them that the police chief was more than welcome to arrive at the estate. I stated that I was actually looking forward to his arrival, because the responding officers were going to find the undeniable, legally admissible evidence of extortion, forgery, and unlawful detainment that they had just proudly confessed to on a secure recording. I sat back in the antique chair, completely relaxed, and watched their entire world begin to collapse. The heavy silence that followed was no longer filled with their arrogant demands. It was filled with the crushing, inescapable realization that they had just locked themselves in a cage of their own making. I held all the keys, and I was never letting them out. The heavy silence that followed my announcement hung in the air for only a few seconds before the fragile reality of my family shattered completely. Harrison stared at my wrist, his eyes locked onto the small, solid red light glowing on the side of my smartwatch. For a brief, terrifying moment, the arrogant venture capitalist disappeared, replaced by a panicked man who realized he might have just confessed to federal crimes on a secure recording. But true to his nature, Harrison possessed an ego far too massive to accept defeat that easily. He could not process the idea that his quiet, dismissed younger sister had somehow outsmarted him. The panic in his eyes quickly hardened into a familiar, vicious defiance. He let out a loud, harsh scoff that echoed sharply off the mahogany walls of the library. He deliberately shifted his weight, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, in a classic display of defensive arrogance. He shook his head, a condescending smirk returning to his face. He told me that I was completely full of it. He declared with absolute certainty that I did not have a legal team, let alone a dedicated corporate security division capable of intercepting and logging encrypted audio in real time. He laughed, a brittle and hollow sound, insisting that I was pulling a desperate, pathetic bluff to try and scare my way out of the locked room. He pointed at my watch and claimed it was probably just a cheap fitness tracker I had bought online to track my steps, not some high-tech espionage device. Beatrice eagerly grabbed onto her son's denial like a lifeline. She let out a long breath of relief from the velvet sofa, her posture relaxing significantly. She chimed in, her voice dripping with its usual toxic sweetness, stating that I had always possessed an incredibly overactive imagination. She told Gregory to ignore my childish theatrics and to keep the police chief on standby. She firmly believed that I was simply trying to stall for time, because I knew I was finally backed into a corner with absolutely no way out. Gregory nodded in agreement, his chest puffing out again as he reassured his wife and son that no struggling freelance coder could possibly afford the kind of retainer required for a high-powered legal team. They collectively decided that my threat was nothing more than a ridiculous, fabricated lie designed to distract them from the loan documents still sitting on the table. Harrison took a step away from the locked oak doors, feeling emboldened by the united front of our parents. He sneered at me, asking if I really expected them to believe that a woman who could not even afford to buy her own car was secretly commanding a legion of corporate lawyers. He demanded that I drop the ridiculous act, pick up the gold fountain pen, and sign the guarantor release immediately. He warned me that his patience was completely exhausted and that the police would be arriving at the front gate any minute now to drag me away in handcuffs. He genuinely thought he had regained total control of the narrative. He thought he had successfully called my bluff and exposed me as a desperate fraud. I did not offer a frantic defense of my technology. I did not try to convince them that the red light on my watch was actually transmitting their voices to a secure server. Arguing with them would only validate their false sense of authority and give them the chaotic interaction they craved. Instead, I decided it was time to completely dismantle the very foundation of their arrogance. I decided it was time to show them exactly how deeply I had infiltrated the financial world they thought they ruled. I placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany desk and slowly stood up from the rigid antique chair. The sudden, deliberate movement instantly shifted the dynamic in the room. Harrison stopped his aggressive pacing. Beatrice stiffened on the sofa. Gregory narrowed his eyes, watching me with a renewed sense of deep suspicion. I did not look at any of them. I simply smoothed out the front of my cashmere sweater, entirely ignoring the damp spot where the sparkling water had spilled, and turned my back on the desk. I walked away from the center of the room, my boots making soft, rhythmic sounds against the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. The library was massive, lined with towering bookshelves, filled with leather-bound volumes that my father purchased strictly for display and never actually read. I ignored the books and the expensive artwork, making my way directly toward the far end of the room. There, a set of grand floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the wall, offering a sweeping view of the estate. The windows were currently covered by heavy dark green velvet drapes that blocked out the majority of the morning sunlight, keeping the library cloaked in a dim, oppressive shadow. I reached out and firmly grasped the edge of the thick velvet fabric. With one smooth, deliberate motion, I pulled the heavy drapes back, sliding them along their brass rod with a loud metallic scraping sound. A sudden flood of bright natural sunlight poured into the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting long, harsh shadows across the faces of my family. I stood bathed in the bright light, looking out through the pristine glass. The view from the library was spectacular. The sprawling back lawn of the estate stretched out for acres, a massive expanse of perfectly manicured bright green grass. Beyond the lawn, I could see the edge of the private tennis courts, the glittering surface of the enormous heated swimming pool, and the elaborate custom-built stone gazebo that my mother treasured above almost anything else in her life. It was a flawless, pristine picture of absolute generational wealth and unquestionable social status. It was the physical manifestation of everything my family valued, and it was currently serving as the collateral for a massive catastrophic failure. I kept my gaze fixed on the beautiful sprawling lawn outside, not bothering to turn around to face the three people standing in the room behind me. I knew they were watching my every move, completely confused by my sudden shift in focus and deeply unnerved by my absolute calm. I let the silence stretch out for a few more seconds, allowing the warmth of the sunlight to wash over my face before I finally delivered the financial guillotine. "You are liquidating the family estate to pay back a high-yield loan to Vanguard Capital, aren't you, Harrison?" I asked. I kept my voice conversational and light, as if I were inquiring about the weather or asking for the time of day, rather than exposing the darkest, most closely guarded financial secret this family possessed. I did not shout, and I did not gloat. I simply laid the ugly, undeniable truth bare for everyone in the room to see. I knew the exact terms of his desperate borrowing. I knew the precise interest rates he had accepted in a blind panic. I knew that he had secretly convinced Gregory to put this entire sprawling property up as collateral to secure the funding his failing venture capital firm needed to stay afloat. And I knew that without my signature on that forged paper, the entire house of cards was about to violently collapse. The name Vanguard Capital hung in the bright sunlit air of the library, like a physical weapon that had just been swung with devastating precision. For a long, agonizing moment, absolutely nobody in the room moved or made a single sound. The confident, aggressive sneer that had been permanently plastered across my brother's face for the entire morning vanished in an instant. It was wiped away so completely that it was as if it had never existed at all. I stood by the grand windows, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun against my back, and watched as every single drop of color rapidly drained from Harrison's cheeks. His skin turned a sickly translucent shade of gray, making the faint shadow of his beard stand out in stark relief. His shoulders suddenly slumped forward, as if an invisible weight had been dropped directly onto his back. He took a stumbling step backward, his expensive leather shoes catching on the edge of the intricate Persian rug. His hands fell limply to his sides, his fingers twitching with sudden, uncontrollable nervous energy. He stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, unable to process the words that had just left my mouth. Vanguard Capital was not a name he had ever shared with our parents. It was his deepest, darkest, most closely guarded financial secret. It was the name of the aggressive high-yield lending institution he had desperately turned to when all the traditional reputable banks had flatly refused to extend him any more credit. It was the absolute last resort of a failing businessman who was drowning in debt and completely out of options. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He closed it, swallowed hard, and tried again. His throat moved visibly as he struggled to find his voice. When he finally managed to force a sentence out, his voice was nothing more than a ragged, breathless whisper. It was completely stripped of its usual loud, booming authority, replaced entirely by a raw, undeniable panic. "How did you find out about Vanguard?" he asked, the words stumbling over each other as they left his mouth. He did not deny the accusation. He did not try to laugh it off or accuse me of making up a ridiculous fabricated lie. The sheer terror in his eyes was the absolute confirmation of his guilt. He was silently begging me to tell him that it was just a lucky guess, a random name I had somehow pulled out of thin air. Beatrice and Gregory exchanged a quick, highly confused glance. They did not understand the profound significance of the name, Vanguard Capital, but they could clearly see the devastating physical effect it was having on their golden son. My father took a step forward from behind his massive mahogany desk. He frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together in a sharp line of deep irritation and growing concern. He looked at Harrison, then turned his aggressive, demanding glare toward me. He loudly demanded to know what on earth I was talking about. He insisted that I explain myself immediately, commanding me to stop speaking in riddles and to stop trying to upset my brother. Harrison completely ignored our father's demanding outburst. He did not look at Gregory, and he did not attempt to reassure his deeply confused mother on the velvet sofa. His entire focus was entirely locked onto me. He was staring at me as if I were a terrifying, unpredictable stranger who had just broken into his home, rather than the quiet, unassuming younger sister he had relentlessly bullied for his entire life. I slowly turned away from the bright sunlit windows and faced my family, my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely devoid of any sympathy or familial affection. I walked back toward the center of the library, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that contrasted sharply with the chaotic, frantic panic radiating from my brother. I stopped a few feet away from the heavy mahogany desk, placing myself right in the middle of their crumbling reality. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring that my tone was cold, clinical, and completely unforgiving. I looked directly at Gregory, deciding to answer his demanding question by laying bare the absolute incompetence of his favorite child. I told my father that his incredibly successful, brilliant son had completely bankrupted his prestigious venture capital firm months ago. I explained in undeniable detail that Harrison had secretly leveraged the entire family estate as the primary collateral to secure a desperately needed, highly aggressive $5 million bridge loan. I watched my father's face contort in sudden shock as he realized the very roof over his head had been secretly gambled away. I informed them that Vanguard Capital was a notoriously ruthless institution that specialized in aggressive debt recovery and high-risk financial acquisitions. Harrison had hidden the severity of his financial ruin from everyone, using forged documents and falsified assets to keep the truth buried. Beatrice let out a sharp, horrified gasp from the sofa, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She looked at Harrison with wide, terrified eyes, silently begging him to deny my accusations, to tell her that I was simply a jealous, lying failure making up a horrible story to ruin their perfect day. But Harrison just stood there, completely frozen, his silence confirming every single devastating word I had just spoken. He finally managed to tear his eyes away from me and looked at his hands, which were visibly shaking at his sides. He took a deep breath and tried to summon some fraction of his former arrogance, but it was a pathetic, transparent attempt. He looked back up at me, his eyes pleading for a lifeline that I was never going to throw him. He desperately claimed that he had it all under control, that he just needed my signature on the guarantor release to finalize a massive deal that would cover the debt and save the estate. He begged me to believe that Vanguard Capital was willing to work with him, that they had promised to extend his deadline as long as he provided the required security documentation today. I let him finish his desperate, pathetic rambling. I let him cling to the tiny, fragile sliver of false hope he had constructed for himself. Then I decided it was time to drop the ultimate world-shattering revelation. I reached into my simple leather tote bag and pulled out my sleek tablet once again. I tapped the screen, bringing up the secure, encrypted financial dashboard that I had personally designed and overseen. I looked down at the glowing screen for a brief second, confirming the live data, and then raised my eyes to meet Harrison's terrified, pleading gaze. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice in a dramatic, theatrical display of victory. I spoke with a quiet, undeniable, and absolutely terrifying certainty that shattered his reality into a million irreparable pieces. Because Vanguard Capital is a direct, wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Cybernetics, I said, letting the words hang in the heavy, stagnant air of the library. I slowly turned to face my father and my mother, ensuring that they heard and completely understood every single syllable of my next sentence. Then I turned my attention back to the brother who had just tried to physically lock me in a room and extort my signature to save his own miserable life. I am your primary creditor, Harrison, I told him, watching the absolute total realization of his doom wash over his gray, panicked face. You do not owe a faceless corporate bank $5 million. You owe me $5 million. And your absolute final grace period expired at exactly noon today. The phrase hung in the air, a definitive death knell to the sprawling financial empire my brother pretended to rule. 12 o'clock noon. The exact time had already come and gone. The final deadline had passed while he was busy mocking my clothes and locking me inside this room. I watched his eyes dart toward the grandfather clock in the corner of the library. The gold hands clearly displayed it was now past the hour. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The absolute finality of the situation penetrated the thick armor of his ego. There were no more extensions to negotiate, no more hidden shell companies to leverage, and no more parents to bail him out. He was completely out of time and out of money. The arrogant venture capitalist, who had aggressively slammed the heavy oak doors shut just moments ago, completely disintegrated right in front of my eyes. The transformation was both pathetic and incredibly satisfying to witness. The rigid tension in his broad shoulders collapsed entirely. The forward-leaning posture he had used to intimidate me evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell of a man. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his chest heaving under his expensive suit jacket as he desperately tried to draw air into his suddenly constricting lungs. Harrison slowly lifted his hands away from his sides. His fingers were trembling violently, betraying the sheer terror coursing through his veins. He took a slow, highly uncertain step backward, physically distancing himself from the locked doors he had so proudly barricaded. He was subconsciously trying to back away from the monstrous consequences of his own disastrous actions. He took another step back, his expensive leather shoes dragging heavily across the Persian rug. He raised his shaking hands up to his chest, holding his palms outward in a universally recognized gesture of surrender. I was trying to look placating. He was desperately attempting to arrange his pale, sweating face into an expression of friendly negotiation. It was a deeply grotesque and unconvincing performance. The malicious sneer he had worn all morning was gone, replaced by a wide-eyed, desperate plea for mercy. He looked at me not as a sister he had relentlessly abused, but as a terrifying, omnipotent deity who held his entire existence in the palm of her hand. He opened his mouth, his jaw working frantically as he struggled to find a voice that was not entirely consumed by panic. When he finally managed to speak, The loud, booming authority was completely gone. His voice was a thin whisper cracking with raw desperation. He tentatively called my name, stretching the syllables out as if testing the waters of a suddenly volatile ocean. He took a hesitant, trembling step forward, lowering his hands slightly in a pathetic attempt to appear non-threatening and reasonable. Hai told me to come on, his voice pitching upward in a frantic whine. He attempted to force a nervous, unnatural laugh, trying to brush away the mountain of federal crimes standing between us. He leaned forward, his eyes wide and stripped of their former arrogance. He invoked the very concept he had actively weaponized against me for my entire life. He reminded me that we were blood. He stated, his voice trembling with emotion, that we were family. He tried to appeal to a deeply ingrained sense of familial loyalty that he himself had never once honored. He spoke the word family as if it were a magical shield that would instantly protect him from the devastating consequences of his own monumental greed. He stood there sweating through his expensive shirt and begged me to remember our shared childhood. He pleaded with me to remember the parents sitting right behind us, completely ignoring the fact that those very same parents had just actively conspired to sacrifice my freedom to save his failing business. I took another slow, shaky step toward me, his hands still raised in that pathetic gesture. He shook his head back and forth, his eyes pleading for a miraculous lifeline. He told me that I could not possibly call in the loan today. He insisted that tearing down his firm and taking the family estate was a disproportionate, cruel response. He begged me to be reasonable, to look at the bigger picture, and to show him the compassion he had aggressively denied me. He lowered his voice to a desperate pitch. He begged me to just give him a 6-month extension. He promised, his voice cracking with panic, that he would figure everything out if I just gave him a little more time. He swore that he would restructure his assets, find new investors, and pay back every single cent he owed to my company. He stood in the middle of the sunlit library, a completely broken, bankrupt fraud, and begged his younger sister for a simple 6-month stay of execution. Beatrice watched this humiliating display from the velvet sofa, her hands clutching her designer purse so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Gregory remained frozen behind his massive mahogany desk, staring at his golden, untouchable son, who was currently begging for his life like a cornered rat. They did not intervene. They did not try to stop him from groveling. They were just as terrified as he was, completely paralyzed by the sudden inversion of power in the room. I stood bathed in the bright, natural sunlight pouring through the grand windows. I looked down at the trembling, desperate man standing before me. I looked at the hands he was holding up in surrender, the very same hands that had confidently tossed forged federal bank documents onto my lap just a short while ago. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel a sudden warming rush of familial affection. I felt an absolute freezing conviction. The time for extending grace to these people had expired long before the noon deadline. I let his pathetic echo into the heavy silence of the library. I allowed the sheer audacity of his demand to fully settle over the room. He had literally locked me inside this space, threatened to obliterate my entire life, and actively attempted to frame me for his own massive financial crimes. Yet he genuinely believed that playing the family card would magically erase all of his vicious, calculated abuse. He genuinely thought he could just ask for a 6-month extension, and I would simply nod and comply. I looked directly into his wide, panicked eyes. I kept my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely devoid of any emotion. I did not raise my voice, but I infused every single syllable with a cold, unforgiving finality that cut straight through his desperate manufactured pleas. I addressed his pathetic attempt to use our shared genetics as a bargaining chip. I told him that blood was exactly what he had tried to bleed entirely dry just to save himself. I reminded him, speaking with slow, deliberate precision, that he had forcefully taken my identity and forged my signature on federal documents. I stated clearly and undeniably that he had actively conspired to frame me for his own massive, devastating felonies. I watched the last remaining glimmer of false hope completely die in his eyes as my words landed with crushing, absolute certainty. I did not offer him a polite rejection. I did not tell him I needed time to consider his request or consult with my financial team. I simply delivered the ultimate unyielding conclusion to his decades of arrogance and abuse. I told him that I absolutely do not give extensions to criminals. The sheer finality of that sentence acted like a physical shockwave tearing through the library. Harrison stumbled backward as if I had struck him, collapsing under the crushing weight of absolute ruin. But the most explosive reaction came from the velvet sofa. Beatrice had spent her adult life cultivating flawless high society elegance. I had ripped that manufactured universe to shreds. She could not process the fact that the daughter she mocked was the sole architect of their total destruction. A sudden piercing shriek erupted from the back of her throat. It was the frantic, terrifying scream of a privileged woman who suddenly realized her power had evaporated. Beatrice launched herself off the velvet sofa with a chaotic burst of violent energy. Her designer purse tumbled to the floor, spilling its expensive contents across the rug. Her face, usually smooth and expertly contoured, twisted into a horrifying mask of pure hatred. Her blue eyes burned with uncontrollable rage as she marched directly toward me. Her expensive heels pounded aggressively against the hardwood floor, the sharp clicking sound echoing like rapid gunfire through the massive library. She closed the distance between us in a matter of mere seconds. I did not take a single step backward. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not cower away from her approaching fury. I stood perfectly still, my feet planted firmly on the floor. I watched her charge at me with the calm, detached observation of someone studying a predictable threat. Beatrice raised her right arm high into the air as she closed the final few feet between us. The heavy gold and diamond rings adorning her fingers caught the bright sunlight pouring through the grand windows, flashing with a sharp, dangerous glare. She aimed a vicious full-force slap directly at my face, pouring decades of accumulated resentment and bitter fury into the violent motion. She intended to physically strike me down and assert her ultimate maternal dominance. She expected me to freeze in fear or turn my face away in weak submission. She was operating under the deeply flawed assumption that I was still the same terrified child she had spent 33 years aggressively bullying. She was profoundly mistaken. Before her hand could even come close to making contact with my cheek, my left arm shot upward with swift, unyielding precision. I moved with a practiced, calculated speed that completely bypassed her frantic emotional assault. I caught her wrist firmly in midair, stopping her violent momentum dead in its tracks. The sharp sound of flesh striking flesh echoed loudly in the quiet library, but it was not the sound of a slap. It was the sound of an absolute, undeniable physical interception. I wrapped my fingers tightly around her thin wrist, locking my grip into place with a cold, unrelenting pressure. I squeezed hard enough to make the heavy gold bracelets dig painfully into her skin, ensuring she felt the undeniable strength of my hold. Beatrice gasped sharply, a sudden breathy sound of pure shock. Her eyes went wide, her pupils dilating as she stared at my hand gripping her arm. She instinctively yanked her arm backward to free herself from my grasp, but I did not let go. I held her wrist suspended in the air between us, completely neutralizing her attack and establishing total, unquestionable physical dominance. I applied enough pressure to make it abundantly clear that she was entirely powerless against me. I looked directly down into her terrified, furious eyes. The heavy layers of expensive makeup could not hide the creeping realization that she had just made a monumental, unforgivable mistake. The matriarch of the family, the woman who had dictated my worth and commanded my obedience for my entire life, was now physically trapped in my grip. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to endure the profound humiliation of her failed assault. I kept my voice incredibly low, stripping away any trace of anger or emotion. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that chilled the air between us. "Don't ever raise your hand to me again, Beatrice," I said deliberately, using her first name to shatter any illusion of maternal authority. I held her gaze for one more long, agonizing second, ensuring the absolute finality of my warning fully penetrated her panicked mind. Then I sharply opened my fingers and dropped her wrist. I did not push her, but the sudden release of tension caused her to stumble backward awkwardly. She caught her balance, massaging the red marks my fingers had left on her skin. She stared at me speechless, struggling to comprehend the reality that she could no longer bully me. The physical confrontation shattered the remaining sanity in the room. Gregory, who had been paralyzed behind his mahogany desk, suddenly snapped into frantic motion. Witnessing his wife overpowered and his son facing federal prison finally broke through his arrogant denial. He realized that brute force and intimidation had failed. He had to rely on the only weapon he understood, which was his wealth. The only way to save the family estate and protect his son was to pay off the debt immediately. He let out a panicked curse and threw himself into his leather desk chair. He scrambled frantically toward his expensive laptop resting on the center of the desk. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly knocked over a heavy crystal paperweight. He flipped the laptop open, the bright screen casting a harsh blue light across his sweating, terrified face. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing with a chaotic, desperate speed. He was desperately trying to log into his secure, offshore financial accounts. He needed to initiate an immediate, high-priority international wire transfer. I firmly believed that if he could just dump $5 million into my corporate accounts right this second, he could magically erase the forged documents, cancel the foreclosure, and instantly return their lives to normal. I stood perfectly still by the grand windows, illuminated by the bright afternoon sun, and watched my father frantically try to buy his way out of the trap they had meticulously set for themselves. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting across the glowing screen as he navigated through security portals and authentication requests. He proudly announced, his voice cracking with desperate authority, that he was wiring the money right now. He loudly declared that he was clearing the bridge loan in full, paying off the debt, and demanding that I cancel the foreclosure proceedings immediately. I let him type for a few more seconds, allowing the false hope to fully blossom in his chest. I let him reach the final confirmation screen. Then I slowly walked over to the edge of the mahogany desk and looked down at him. I kept my voice perfectly even, a gentle, devastating whisper that completely obliterated his frantic efforts. I informed him that his offshore accounts were entirely useless. I explained that when Harrison used the family estate as collateral for the bridge loan, he had signed a specific acceleration clause. I watched Gregory's hands freeze over the keyboard as my words registered. I told him that because the noon deadline had passed without payment, Vanguard Capital had instantly initiated standard default protocols. I stated clearly that my corporate legal team had already frozen every single one of his collateral assets, locking down all associated accounts at exactly 12 o'clock and 1 minute. Gregory stared at the bright laptop screen, his bloodshot eyes darting back and forth across the series of stark red error messages that had suddenly populated his secure browser window. He pressed the refresh key with a trembling, desperate finger, hoping against all rational logic that a simple technical glitch had caused the sudden denial of access. The screen blinked, loading for an agonizing second before displaying the exact same unforgiving notification. Access denied. Assets frozen pending creditor review. He let out a strange, wheezing gasp, a sound of total, devastating defeat that seemed to physically deflate his broad chest. He pushed himself away from the heavy mahogany desk, his expensive leather chair rolling backward and bumping hard into the tall floor-to-ceiling bookshelves behind him. He raised his shaking hands to his face, rubbing his temples as if trying to forcefully massage away a sudden blinding migraine. The powerful patriarch of the family, the man who had effortlessly controlled every single aspect of my existence with an iron fist and an overflowing bank account, had just been completely financially neutralized in a matter of seconds. He looked up at me, his face suddenly looking incredibly old and deeply tired, entirely stripped of the fierce, aggressive authority he had wielded just moments before. He finally understood the absolute, inescapable reality of the financial trap he had willingly walked into. He understood that my corporate reach was vastly superior to his local banking connections and that his money could no longer protect him. He slumped down into his chair, utterly paralyzed by the staggering magnitude of his own failure. Harrison, however, was fundamentally incapable of accepting this profound defeat. His entire fragile identity was constructed around the absolute delusion of his own supreme intelligence and unquestionable power. Watching our father give up completely shattered the final desperate illusion he was clinging to so fiercely. If Gregory could not simply buy their way out of this catastrophic disaster, then Harrison was truly facing total inescapable ruin. The panic bubbling inside him instantly boiled over into a frantic, unhinged hysteria. He stepped away from the locked oak doors, completely abandoning his self-appointed post as the physical barricade. He paced erratically across the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, his hands running frantically through his perfectly styled hair, entirely ruining the expensive polished look he had spent an hour crafting this morning. He turned his body toward me, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure frantic denial. He pointed a shaking, accusing finger directly at my face, his voice cracking violently as he screamed at the top of his lungs. He yelled that I was completely insane. He shouted that I was a delusional, psychotic liar who was making up a ridiculous fantasy simply to torture him. He aggressively insisted that there was absolutely no possible way a washed-up, pathetic freelance coder could successfully orchestrate a multi-million-dollar corporate takeover right under his nose. He took a heavy stomping step closer, his chest heaving with manic energy, desperately trying to use loud volume to drown out the undeniable facts staring him right in the face. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with a toxic, desperate malice that sought to tear me down to his level. He screamed that I did not possess this kind of extraordinary power. He demanded that I look at myself, gesturing wildly at my plain black cashmere sweater and my simple dark jeans. He yelled that I was so fundamentally broke, so entirely insignificant, and so completely unsuccessful that I did not even own a car. He weaponized that specific manufactured insult, aggressively clinging to the fabricated narrative that I had taken a rideshare to the family estate simply because I was too impoverished to afford a reliable vehicle of my own. He genuinely believed that if he screamed his insults loud enough, he could magically overwrite reality and force me back into the subservient, pathetic role he desperately needed me to occupy. He needed me to be the failure so he could remain the golden child. He stood in the center of the grand library, completely stripped of his professional dignity, shouting until his throat was raw, entirely convinced that his verbal abuse could somehow reverse the foreclosure and restore his stolen empire. I simply stood by the grand windows, bathed in the warm afternoon sunlight, completely unfazed by his loud, hysterical outburst. I did not bother to correct his deeply flawed assumption about my transportation. I did not need to defend my immense wealth or explain my deliberate, understated lifestyle choices to a man who was currently facing multiple federal fraud charges and the complete loss of his home. I just watched him unravel, letting his frantic, pathetic screams bounce harmlessly off the solid mahogany walls of the library. But just as he finished his sentence, just as the cruel, mocking echo of his final insult hung heavily in the stagnant air of the room, the atmosphere around us began to shift in a profound and deeply terrifying way. It did not begin with a loud, sudden crash or a blinding flash of light. It started as an incredibly low, deep vibration that seemed to originate from the very ground beneath our feet. It was a rhythmic, pulsing thump that resonated fiercely through the heavy hardwood floors and traveled straight up through the solid soles of my practical leather boots. The sound was incredibly deep, a heavy mechanical heartbeat that rapidly grew in volume and sheer physical intensity. It was completely unlike any of the familiar, comforting sounds of the quiet Connecticut estate. It was not the gentle hum of luxury landscaping equipment or the distant muffled roar of a sports car engine speeding down the private driveway. It was an aggressive displacement of air that signaled the immediate arrival of something incredibly large and overwhelmingly powerful. The low, rhythmic thumping sound began to violently rattle the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the library. The thick, custom-cut glass panes vibrated aggressively within their sturdy wooden frames, creating a sharp, continuous buzzing noise that quickly drowned out the frantic, panicked breathing of my family. Harrison froze dead in the middle of the room, his mouth still slightly open from his hysterical screaming. He looked frantically toward the ceiling, completely disoriented by the overwhelming noise vibrating through every single surface of the room. Beatrice sat perfectly still on the velvet sofa, her manicured hands gripping the armrests so tightly that her knuckles turned completely white. The deep mechanical vibrations intensified rapidly, sending a powerful, inescapable shockwave through the heavy antique furniture. On the polished silver tray resting on the coffee table right in front of my mother, her prized, incredibly delicate antique teacups began to dance. The fine, imported porcelain rattled violently against the matching saucers, producing a frantic, high-pitched clinking sound that added a sharp note of terror to the growing chaos in the room. The expensive teacups spun and bumped into each other with increasing, uncontrolled violence, as the deafening roar of the approaching aircraft completely consumed the space. The powerful vibrations reached a critical, unbearable frequency, and one by one the fragile antique teacups began to violently shatter. The delicate porcelain exploded into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces, scattering forcefully across the polished silver tray and raining down onto the pristine surface of the expensive Persian rug, destroying the illusion of their perfect, untouchable world. The chaotic sound of the shattering porcelain was instantly swallowed whole by the overwhelming, deafening roar that now completely consumed the atmosphere of the library. The low pulsing vibration that had initially rattled the floorboards had rapidly escalated into an aggressive, ear-splitting thunder. It sounded as though a massive hurricane had suddenly materialized right in the middle of our private Connecticut estate. The sheer volume of the noise made it impossible to speak, to think, or to even process the rapidly unfolding reality. Harrison clapped his hands firmly over his ears, his face twisting into a grimace of pure physical discomfort as the intense sound waves battered against his eardrums. He stumbled blindly away from the center of the room, completely disoriented by the unexpected sensory assault. Beatrice remained frozen on the velvet sofa, her eyes wide with a primal, unadulterated terror, watching the remaining pieces of her shattered antique teacups tremble and slide across the polished silver tray. Gregory gripped the edge of his heavy mahogany desk with white-knuckled intensity, his jaw slack as he stared wildly around the vibrating room, entirely powerless to stop the forceful invasion of his heavily guarded sanctuary. The source of the catastrophic noise was no longer a mystery, but a physical force violently assaulting the exterior of the house. Outside the grand floor-to-ceiling windows, the usually calm and serene afternoon air had been whipped into a chaotic, swirling frenzy. A massive, unnatural gale forcefully slammed against the thick panes of custom-cut glass. The heavy wooden window frames groaned and creaked under the immense sustained pressure, sounding as if they were on the verge of buckling inward and sending shards of glass flying at any given second. The heavy velvet drapes that I had pulled back earlier began to billow and snap wildly in the drafty air, heavily disturbed by the intense pressure differential building outside. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the disturbance outside finally broke through the paralyzing shock holding my family captive. Drawn by a morbid, irresistible combination of deep terror and profound confusion, Gregory was the very first person to move. He slowly released his desperate death grip on the mahogany desk and took a slow, hesitant step toward the locked French doors that led out onto the back patio. Harrison quickly followed suit, his previous arrogance entirely replaced by the fearful, wide-eyed curiosity of a cornered animal. Bianca and Beatrice eventually stood up from their respective places in the room, huddling incredibly close together as they cautiously approached the vibrating glass. They gathered tightly around the tall French doors, their faces pressed close to the glass as they stared out at the sprawling, once pristine back lawn. What they saw completely defied their lifelong understanding of their sheltered, privileged reality. The meticulously manicured landscape, a space they had spent decades and countless thousands of dollars perfecting to impress their high society friends, was being systematically and violently torn to shreds right before their very eyes. The powerful localized hurricane was aggressively flattening the lush, perfectly green grass into a swirling, chaotic sea of flying debris. Beatrice let out a muffled, horrified gasp as she watched her prized award-winning rose bushes, the absolute pride of her extensive gardening efforts, violently whipped back and forth by the relentless, punishing downdraft. The delicate, carefully cultivated blooms were mercilessly ripped from their thorny stems, sending a thick flurry of bright red and pink petals spiraling wildly into the turbulent air, The heavy wrought iron patio furniture was pushed and dragged roughly across the expensive stone pavers, scraping loudly against the surface, before being unceremoniously toppled over and tossed aside by the sheer unyielding force of the wind. The entire backyard was being subjected to a brutal, unapologetic display of raw mechanical power that left my family absolutely breathless. Then the massive imposing shadow that had been rapidly darkening the lawn finally materialized into a terrifying physical shape. Descending steadily from the bright, clear blue sky was a massive state-of-the-art corporate helicopter. It was not a small standard private charter or a generic lightweight news chopper. It was a sleek, highly customized Augusta Westland, an absolute flying fortress of undeniable wealth and supreme corporate authority. The entire body of the massive aircraft was painted in a stealthy light, absorbing matte black finish that made it look incredibly aggressive and deeply intimidating against the mundane backdrop of the traditional suburban estate. The massive spinning rotor blades sliced through the air with a terrifying rhythmic violence, generating the intense, crushing downdraft that was actively destroying everything directly beneath it. The sheer size of the heavy machine completely dwarfed the stone patio and the surrounding decorative gardens. It descended with a smooth, highly calculated precision, resembling a massive predatory hawk, slowly lowering itself directly into a nest of panicked, helpless mice. My terrified family stared at the descending aircraft in a state of absolute paralyzed shock. Their mouths hung wide open, their eyes unblinking, as they desperately struggled to comprehend the completely impossible scene unfolding right in their own backyard. They had lived their entire lives arrogantly believing that their inherited wealth made them permanently untouchable, fully convinced that their social status automatically shielded them from the unpredictable chaos of the outside world. Now a massive, deafening machine was forcefully invading their private airspace, aggressively and unapologetically violating the sacred, carefully protected boundaries of their pristine estate. The heavy landing gear of the matte black helicopter finally made hard contact with the ground. It touched down heavily onto the prized, perfectly leveled back lawn. The immense crushing weight of the aircraft instantly sank deep into the soft, manicured turf, leaving massive, permanent ruts tearing through the expensive grass. The powerful roar of the jet engine slowly began to shift its high pitch as the pilot expertly throttled down the power, but the massive overhead rotor blades continued to spin rapidly, maintaining a strong, steady current of intense wind that aggressively whipped the remaining dirt and garden debris back and forth across the stone patio. As the swirling, chaotic dust and the shredded red rose petals slowly began to settle around the massive idling aircraft, a specific, highly deliberate detail finally became clearly visible through the hazy atmosphere. My family pressed their pale faces even closer to the vibrating glass of the French doors, their widened eyes desperately searching for any sort of logical explanation, any rational reason for this terrifying, unprecedented invasion of their property. Then they finally saw it. Positioned prominently on the long, sleek tail of the matte black helicopter was a large custom-painted corporate emblem. The sharp, imposing letters were expertly crafted from a highly reflective, gleaming silver material that perfectly caught the bright afternoon sunlight and flashed brilliantly against the dark matte paint. The bold, undeniable logo spelled out a single completely devastating word: Apex. Gregory let out a ragged, trembling breath, his broad shoulders slumping heavily as the final crushing piece of the terrifying puzzle violently and decisively snapped into its proper place. Harrison stared blankly at the shining silver letters, his eyes expanding with a fresh, overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated terror. They slowly turned their heads and looked from the gleaming silver logo directly back to me, standing calmly and quietly in the center of the ruined library. They finally completely understood the absolute, terrifying magnitude of the unstoppable corporate monster they had so blindly and foolishly chosen to awaken today. For several long seconds, none of them moved. The silver Apex logo on the helicopter's tail flashed in the afternoon sunlight, while the rotors continued to beat the air into a furious storm. Gregory stared through the French doors as if the machine had descended from another world. Bianca's hands had risen to her mouth. Harrison stood slightly behind her, his face drained of color, searching desperately for some explanation that would allow him to keep believing I was still the powerless sister he had mocked all morning. I let them stare. I wanted the image to settle permanently into their memory. The black aircraft on the lawn, the ruined roses, the torn grass, and the corporate name they had just spent the last hour refusing to believe belonged to me. I glanced down at the slim watch on my wrist. The display changed silently as another minute rolled over. The schedule was perfectly exact. I looked directly back toward Harrison. His eyes were still fixed on the helicopter, and I could almost see him trying to calculate how much it cost, who had authorized it, and why it had landed on the estate at the exact moment his financial world collapsed. I allowed a small smile to touch my mouth. "Ah, 12:05 p.m., my ride's here," I said calmly. The words were nearly swallowed by the rotor noise, but every person in the library heard them. Harrison's head snapped toward me. Bianca's eyes widened. Gregory gripped the edge of the desk. Beatrice simply stared, unable to summon another insult. Outside, the aircraft settled completely onto the lawn. The landing gear pressed deep into the expensive turf-carving dark trenches through the flawless green surface. The pilot held the machine steady while the rotors continued spinning at a controlled speed. The downdraft rolled across the gardens in punishing waves. A row of lightweight decorative planters tipped over along the stone terrace, spilling dark soil across the pale pavers. Loose cushions from the wrought iron chairs tore free and sailed across the yard. Beatrice made a strangled sound when one of the larger cushions slammed into the latticework of her treasured stone gazebo. Then the next blast hit. The canvas shade stretched across the gazebo snapped loose from one corner with a violent crack. The structure shuddered under the pressure. A decorative wooden panel tore away, struck one of the supporting posts, and sent a shower of splinters across the grass. Beatrice rushed toward the glass palms flattening against it, as if she could somehow protect the garden by sheer force of outrage. Another concentrated wave of air caught the already damaged structure. The weakened paneling folded inward, and a section of the gazebo collapsed sideways into the rosebed. Beatrice gasped, as though she had watched a person fall. I felt nothing. That gazebo had always mattered more to her than most of my childhood accomplishments. Harrison finally found his voice. He demanded to know whether I had deliberately ordered the pilot to destroy the property. The accusation would have been funny if he had not sounded so genuinely desperate. I reminded him that the lawn was already collateral under a defaulted loan, and that he had much larger problems than damaged landscaping. He turned toward Gregory for support, but our father remained speechless. For the first time in my life, he looked at me without condescension. What I saw instead was calculation mixed with fear. He was finally revising every assumption he had ever made about me, and the process was visibly painful. A sharp mechanical click came from the helicopter. The side door unlocked and began to slide open. The movement immediately drew everyone's attention back outside. The dark cabin interior appeared behind the tinted glass, revealing soft leather seats and polished metal fixtures. Harrison leaned closer to the French doors. Bianca shifted beside him, suddenly very still. They had already seen the Apex logo, but some irrational part of them was clearly hoping the person who stepped out would somehow contradict everything I had told them. A polished black shoe appeared first on the aircraft's step. Then Preston emerged into the violent wind. He wore a dark bespoke suit beneath a fitted overcoat, perfectly composed, despite the downdraft pulling at the fabric. One hand gripped the doorframe while he descended, and the other held a customized leather briefcase with reinforced brass corners. He paused on the lawn only long enough to make sure the door was secure behind him. Then he lowered his head against the rotor wash and began walking directly toward the stone patio. My family watched him approach in complete silence. Preston did not look like a chauffeur, a charter employee, or a casual assistant. Everything about his posture announced executive authority. He moved with the efficient calm of a man who had performed difficult tasks for powerful people many times before. When he reached the edge of the patio, he brushed a few shredded rose petals from the shoulder of his coat without breaking stride. The leather briefcase remained level in his hand. Harrison's gaze locked onto it immediately. "Who is that?" Bianca asked, her voice barely audible. I did not look at her. "My executive assistant." The answer seemed to strike Harrison harder than the helicopter itself. He turned fully toward me, disbelief giving way to dread. 5 minutes earlier, he had mocked the idea that I possessed a legal team. Now one of my senior employees had arrived by corporate aircraft, carrying a briefcase toward the house at the precise moment his loan entered default. He knew even before the case was opened that whatever was inside would not contain an extension. The briefcase itself became the center of gravity in the room. Gregory stared at it with the instinctive fear of a businessman who knew official paper could do more damage than any shouted threat. Harrison's eyes tracked every step Preston took. Bianca whispered something to him, but he did not answer. Beatrice backed away from the doors and clutched the front of her blouse. None of them asked me to sign the guarantor release anymore. The gold fountain pen remained abandoned on the desk. Preston climbed the patio steps, carefully adjusting his pace as the rotor wash pushed against him. He stopped just outside the French doors and glanced through the glass until our eyes met. He gave me a brief professional nod. No drama, no confusion, no hesitation. That simple gesture frightened my family more than any theatrical display could have. It confirmed that he knew exactly who I was, exactly why he was there, and exactly what authority I held. I walked toward the French doors. Harrison instinctively moved as if to block me again, then caught himself. The memory of the recording, the frozen assets, and the aircraft on the lawn finally overpowered his reflex to intimidate me. He stepped aside. I placed my hand on the brass latch while the family gathered behind me in a tight, frightened cluster. Through the glass, Preston shifted the customized leather briefcase into both hands and waited. The helicopter continued idling behind him like a black mechanical warning. I opened the door and the cold rotor wind rushed into the library, lifting loose papers from the mahogany desk and sending my mother's $500 check fluttering across the floor. Preston stepped forward, carrying the documents that would make the foreclosure impossible for any of them to deny. The instant the French doors opened, the roar outside surged through the library. Loose pages lifted from the desk and spun across the floor. Beatrice's ridiculous $500 check skittered beneath a chair. Preston stepped over the threshold without reacting to the chaos. He closed the distance between us, stopped with the precise posture he used in board meetings, and inclined his head slightly. His eyes never wandered toward my parents or my brother. He addressed only me. "CEO," he said clearly, "the foreclosure paperwork has been finalized by the state judge." Even through the rotor noise, every word landed with brutal clarity. The title hit my family first. CEO. Not Autumn. Not freelancer. Not coder. Preston used the title naturally without emphasis, because to him, my authority was not a performance that needed explanation. Harrison's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Gregory looked from Preston to me, his face tightening as another layer of denial disappeared. Bianca pressed both hands against her chest. Beatrice stared at Preston as though she wanted to order him off the property, but even she seemed to understand that the time when her commands mattered had ended. Preston placed the customized leather briefcase on the edge of the mahogany desk and released the brass clasps. He opened the case toward me. Inside rested a meticulously organized stack of documents secured beneath a black leather strap. A state seal was visible on the upper page, followed by court authentication, creditor notices, and the completed transfer instruments. Preston removed the stack, checked the tabs one final time, and handed it directly to me. I accepted the papers and felt their weight settle into my hands. They were heavier than the forged loan packet Harrison had thrown into my lap that morning, but this time the weight belonged to me. I slowly turned toward my brother. He had backed away until the edge of the Persian rug pressed against his heels. His eyes were fixed on the state seal. Whatever remained of his bravado vanished completely. "Autumn," he whispered. "Wait." I walked toward him without hurrying. Nobody tried to stop me. Gregory remained behind the desk, pale and rigid. Bianca moved away from her husband as though bankruptcy might be contagious. Beatrice's breathing had become quick and shallow. Harrison lifted his hands, palms outward, repeating my name and trying to begin another plea. I did not allow him to finish. I dropped the thick stack of foreclosure papers directly against his chest. His hands came up automatically to catch them. The impact forced him back half a step. Several pages shifted, exposing the official seal and the bold property description identifying the Greenwich estate. Harrison looked down and began reading. His eyes moved rapidly across the first page, then slowed when he reached the creditor name, Vanguard Capital, wholly owned subsidiary of Apex Cybernetics. Beneath it was the court-approved transfer language triggered by the expired default. "No," he said. It was barely a sound. He flipped to the next page, then another. The documents confirmed what I had already told him. The grace period had ended. The collateral seizure had been authorized. The estate was no longer under Gregory's control, and Harrison had no remaining contractual right to use it as leverage for another rescue loan. The ownership interest securing the property had transferred according to the default provisions and the judicial order Preston had just delivered. For once, nobody accused me of bluffing. Nobody called the website fake or questioned whether Apex existed. The state seal had accomplished what years of explanations never could. It forced them to confront a reality that did not depend on their approval, their reputation, or the version of me they had invented and imposed. Harrison looked up at me with a face I barely recognized. The older brother who had towered over me an hour earlier was gone. In his place stood a terrified man holding the legal proof of his own collapse. I remembered every insult he had thrown across the library: the plain sweater, the rideshare, the imaginary broken sedan, the accusation that I knew nothing about finance. Most of all, I remembered the contempt in his voice when he had laughed that I could not even afford a car. I let the silence hold for one deliberate second. "You called me poor," I said. "You said I couldn't even afford a car." His eyes flicked toward the black helicopter visible through the open doors. "You're right," I continued. Traffic in Connecticut is terrible. I prefer flying." Bianca made a small choking sound. Gregory lowered himself slowly into his desk chair, as though his legs could no longer support him. Harrison stared at me, completely unable to answer. The sentence did not need another explanation. The aircraft on the lawn. Preston at my side. The public company they had denied, and the court papers in Harrison's hands had already supplied everything else. Beatrice pushed past Bianca and seized the upper edge of the document stack. "Give me that," she snapped, trying to summon her familiar authority. Harrison released the pages without resistance. My mother pulled the first sheet toward her face and scanned it with frantic speed. Her manicured finger traced the property description, then moved down to the transfer language. She found the state seal and stopped. Her expression changed with frightening speed. Rage disappeared first, then disbelief. Then the last traces of color drained from her cheeks. She read the company name again, whispering "Apex" under her breath. Her eyes traveled to the windows and the silver logo on the helicopter tail. Then she looked back at me. "This house," she said weakly. "This is our house." "It was," I answered. Gregory surged forward, demanding to see the order, but Beatrice did not hand it to him. Her fingers had begun to tremble. She stared around the library at the mahogany walls, the bookshelves, the Persian rug, and the expensive objects she had used for decades as evidence of her superiority. For the first time, none of it belonged safely to her. The estate she believed defined the family name was now controlled by the daughter she had treated as an embarrassment. Preston calmly removed a second copy from the briefcase and placed it in front of Gregory. My father grabbed it and started reading, turning pages with increasing desperation. His lips moved silently as he searched for a loophole. He found none. The order was complete. The default provisions were documented. The transfer had been finalized. His local influence could not rewrite a state judge's signature. Harrison sank onto the edge of a chair. Bianca stood several feet away from him, staring at the foreclosure papers, as though they had personally betrayed her. The helicopter continued to idle outside its rotors, beating a steady rhythm over the wrecked lawn. Rose petals blew through the open doorway and scattered across the library floor. Beatrice's grip loosened. The papers slipped from her fingers and fluttered onto the Persian rug. She drew one short breath, then another. Her eyes rolled upward. Gregory shouted her name, but her knees had already given way. She collapsed backward onto the rug, unconscious, directly beside the official documents transferring the estate to my company. I looked down at her for a moment, then at Harrison. The family meeting they had designed to humiliate me had ended with my mother on the floor, my brother bankrupt, and my helicopter waiting outside. The oppressive silence following the helicopter's arrival was finally broken by a sharp gasp from the floor. Gregory tore his eyes away from the gleaming silver logo and looked down at his wife. Beatrice lay motionless on the Persian rug, her designer dress wrinkled. The shock of seeing the deed to the estate transferred to my company had overloaded her fragile mind. Gregory let out a ragged breath and dropped to his knees beside her. The powerful patriarch was now reduced to a frantic old man. He gently patted her pale cheek, his hands shaking violently to coax her back to consciousness. He called her name, his voice cracking with unfamiliar panic, but Beatrice remained entirely unresponsive. While Gregory tended to his unconscious wife, the illusion of Harrison's perfect marriage violently imploded. Bianca stood frozen near the shattered antique teacups, her mind struggling to process the devastating reality. She looked at the foreclosure documents on Harrison's chest, then at the terrified expression on her husband's face. The horrifying truth finally pierced through her entitlement. The luxurious summer timeshare she had bragged about was gone. The endless credit limits and the sprawling estate were wiped out. She was married to a bankrupt fraud. A furious scream ripped from Bianca's throat. She launched herself at Harrison, her manicured hands curling into fists. She slammed her fists against his chest, striking him repeatedly as a torrent of vicious accusations poured from her mouth. She screamed that he had lied to her, humiliated her in front of her high society friends, and ruined her life. She demanded to know how he could lose everything to a sister he had sworn was a penniless failure. Harrison did not defend himself. He stood there absorbing her blows and venomous insults. He looked entirely hollowed out, a broken shell running on empty. The chaotic symphony of Bianca's screaming and Gregory's frantic whispering was interrupted by a distinct sound approaching the estate. Over the dying roar of the helicopter engine outside, the authoritative wail of police sirens pierced the air. The flashing red and blue lights of a local patrol car reflected brightly against the heavy glass of the French doors. The local police chief, the man Gregory had proudly called 30 minutes ago to have me arrested, was aggressively pulling his vehicle up the winding driveway. He parked his cruiser haphazardly on the front lawn, bypassing the designated parking area. Harrison's head snapped up at the sound of the sirens. A desperate flicker of hope ignited in his dark eyes. He genuinely believed his father's deep community connections could still save him. He thought the police chief would simply walk into the library, ignore the massive corporate helicopter resting on the lawn, and blindly follow Gregory's orders to arrest me for trespassing. He took a stumbling step toward the doors to welcome his perceived savior. But my executive assistant Preston was already moving. Preston had remained standing quietly on the stone patio, observing the chaos inside the library with a calm, professional detachment. As the heavy footsteps of the police chief echoed through the grand marble hallway of the main house, Preston stepped smoothly through the open French doors and entered the room. He bypassed the weeping patriarch and the screaming wife, walking with the confident stride of a man who held absolute authority. He carried his customized leather briefcase in his left hand, his posture perfectly straight. The heavy oak doors of the library were pushed open from the outside, and the local police chief stepped into the room. He was an imposing man in a crisp uniform, his hand resting instinctively on his utility belt. He looked around the chaotic scene, his eyes darting from Beatrice lying on the rug to the shattered porcelain, and finally to the black helicopter idling outside the window. He looked profoundly confused, entirely unprepared for the display of corporate power confronting him. He turned toward Gregory, expecting his wealthy friend's commanding voice. Preston did not give Gregory the chance to utter a single word. He stepped directly into the police chief's line of sight, smoothly blocking his view of my father. Preston extended his right hand in a polite greeting, introducing himself clearly and confidently as the lead legal liaison for Apex Cybernetics. The police chief hesitated for a fraction of a second before shaking Preston's hand, clearly thrown off balance by the formal introduction in the middle of a domestic disturbance. Preston did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. He placed his customized leather briefcase flat onto the mahogany desk, right next to the puddle of spilled sparkling water and my mother's pathetic $500 check. He snapped the brass locks open with a sharp, decisive click that echoed loudly in the tense room. He pulled out a thick, meticulously organized red folder and handed it directly to the police chief. Preston kept his voice perfectly even, maintaining a respectful but firm tone. He informed the chief that the folder contained irrefutable, legally authenticated evidence of severe federal crimes committed by the two men currently standing in the room. He explained, detailing the charges with clinical precision, that the documents provided undeniable proof of multi-million-dollar wire fraud, identity theft, and the deliberate forgery of federal banking guarantees. He pointed out that the evidence included digitally tracked IP addresses, matching the computers in this very house, time-stamped financial transfers, and the secure audio recording. The police chief opened the red folder, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the top pages. The confident, reassuring demeanor he had brought into the room instantly vanished. He was a local officer accustomed to handling minor suburban disputes and traffic violations. He was now staring at a comprehensive, bulletproof dossier of massive corporate fraud compiled by a multi-billion-dollar technology firm. He realized with a chilling clarity that he was not here to help a wealthy friend deal with an unruly daughter. He was standing in the middle of a major federal crime scene. The chief slowly closed the red folder and looked back up. The friendly familiarity he usually reserved for Gregory was completely gone, replaced by a rigid, uncompromising professionalism. He understood that any attempt to protect my father or my brother would immediately result in his own career being destroyed by the massive legal team backing Apex Cybernetics. He turned his attention away from the desk and walked directly toward Harrison. Harrison stumbled backward, his hands rising defensively into the air. He stammered frantically, calling the chief by his first name, trying to invoke their years of friendly interactions at country club dinners and holiday parties. He begged the officer to listen to reason, insisting that the entire situation was just a massive family misunderstanding that could easily be sorted out without involving handcuffs. The local police chief did not respond to the desperate pleas. He reached to his utility belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp metallic clinking sound cut through Harrison's pathetic begging. The officer grabbed Harrison's wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with a firm, practiced motion. As the cold steel locked tightly around my brother's wrists, the police chief began to speak, his voice loud and clear, carrying the absolute devastating weight of the law. He informed Harrison that he had the right to remain silent, delivering the final blow. I stood in the sunlight and watched my golden brother finally fall. The heavy steel handcuffs locked around his wrists with a sharp metallic clack that seemed to echo endlessly across the vast expanse of the ruined library. Harrison slumped forward until his knees hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. The pristine, tailored fabric of his expensive suit wrinkled and strained against the awkward angle of his bound arms. All the aggressive, suffocating arrogance that had defined his entire existence completely evaporated in the span of a few brutal seconds. He was no longer the untouchable venture capitalist who commanded boardrooms and bullied his younger sister. He was just a terrified, bankrupt criminal kneeling in the wreckage of his own monumental greed. The local police chief maintained a firm grip on the chain connecting the metal cuffs, his posture rigid and professional, entirely ignoring the pathetic, whimpering sounds tearing from my brother's raw throat. Across the room, the situation was equally devastating. The second patrol unit had arrived rapidly, and another officer was firmly escorting a thoroughly defeated Gregory toward the open French doors. My father moved with a slow, shuffling gait, his head bowed low, stripped of every ounce of his formidable patriarchal authority. He did not look back at the grand mahogany desk where he had ruled our family for decades. He did not look at his weeping son on the floor. He simply allowed himself to be led away, completely shattered by the undeniable evidence of his federal fraud. Beatrice was just beginning to stir on the Persian rug, her perfectly manicured hands fluttering weakly as she opened her eyes to a reality that was vastly more terrifying than the one she had fainted to escape. Bianca stood pressed against the far wall, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, actively avoiding eye contact with the man she had proudly called her husband just 20 minutes ago. She was already calculating her exit strategy, mentally preparing to distance herself from the radioactive fallout of his impending highly publicized incarceration. Harrison realized with a sudden crushing clarity that he was entirely out of allies. His powerful father was in custody. His status-obsessed mother was incapacitated on the floor. His opportunistic wife was mentally drafting divorce papers. He had absolutely nobody left to manipulate, and nowhere left to hide. In a final desperate act of pure survival, he twisted his body around, fighting against the heavy restraint of the police chief, and locked his tear-filled eyes directly onto me. The malice and contempt that had burned in his gaze all morning were now entirely gone, replaced by a raw, naked, and deeply pathetic pure desperation. He stared up at me from his knees, his chest heaving with erratic, panicked breaths. He struggled to find his voice, his throat working frantically as he attempted to swallow down his terror. When he finally spoke, his voice was a ragged, wet whisper that cracked painfully under the immense weight of his total ruin. He called out my name, stretching the syllables into a desperate, agonizing plea. He begged me to please just make it all stop. I then frantically promised that he would sign whatever confessions I wanted, that he would publicly admit to stealing the application code 5 years ago, and that he would spend the rest of his life working to pay back every single cent he had fraudulently taken. He promised absolute unconditional submission if I would just tell the corporate lawyers to immediately withdraw the completely damning criminal evidence. I remained standing perfectly still by the grand windows, illuminated by the bright afternoon sunlight streaming into the library. I did not step forward to comfort him. I did not display a single flicker of sympathy or hesitation. I simply watched him grovel, observing the miserable, undignified collapse of my lifelong abuser. Harrison saw the absolute coldness in my eyes, and his panic escalated into full-blown hysteria. He strained against the handcuffs, leaning forward as far as the police chief would allow. He raised his voice into a high-pitched, frantic wail that scraped unpleasantly against the walls of the room. He screamed out loud for mercy. He yelled out that we were blood, desperately trying to invoke the biological connection he had repeatedly used to justify his cruelty. He cried out that we were family, pleading with me to remember our shared childhood and the parents who were currently suffering alongside him. He begged me to look at his situation not as a ruthless corporate creditor, but as a loving, forgiving sister. He asked me how I could possibly stand there and watch my own flesh and blood be dragged away to a dark, lonely federal prison. I let his pathetic, hysterical questions hang in the heavy air of the library. I allowed the sheer, unadulterated hypocrisy of his begging to fully settle over the room. He had literally locked me inside this very space, aggressively threatened to obliterate my entire life, and actively conspired to frame me for his own massive financial crimes. Yet he genuinely believed that simply saying the word family would magically erase a lifetime of vicious, calculated abuse. I slowly reached down and picked up the soft, unbranded wool coat I had draped over the back of the antique chair when I first arrived. I slid my arms smoothly into the sleeves, adjusting the collar with a calm, deliberate precision. I began to button the front of the coat, my fingers moving steadily from the bottom to the top. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my expression completely terrifyingly indifferent. I did not raise my voice, but I infused every single word with a cold, unforgiving finality that cut straight through his frantic, desperate sobbing. I looked directly down into his wide, panicked eyes. I told him that my family would never have actively tried to destroy me. I stated clearly and undeniably that a real family would never have stolen my work, mocked my existence, or forged my signature to frame me for multiple federal felonies. I watched the last remaining glimmer of false hope completely die in his eyes as my words landed with crushing, absolute certainty. I informed him that our shared genetics meant absolutely nothing to me, and that his desperate appeals to a non-existent familial bond were entirely useless. I finished buttoning my coat and smoothed down the front, signaling the absolute end of our interaction. I looked around the lavish mahogany-paneled library, taking in the towering bookshelves, the grand fireplace, and the shattered porcelain scattered across the expensive rug. I turned my attention back to the weeping man on the floor and delivered the ultimate devastating conclusion to his decades of arrogance. I told him that he now had exactly 24 hours to gather whatever pathetic belongings he still had left and completely vacate my property. I watched his jaw drop open in fresh, uncomprehending horror as the full weight of my ownership finally registered in his mind. I explained, speaking with slow, deliberate precision, that my private contractors were already scheduled to arrive at the estate tomorrow afternoon. I stated that they had strict, uncompromising orders to completely demolish the main house level, the pristine gardens, and tear up the entire foundation. I suggested that he should call a cheap rideshare service right now to handle his rapid, humiliating eviction. I told him, matching his exact mocking tone, that I heard the rates in Connecticut were actually very reasonable. The last of Harrison's begging followed me only as far as the French doors. I turned away before he could repeat the word family again. Behind me, the police chief tightened his grip on my brother's arm and instructed him to stand. Another officer was guiding Gregory toward the hallway. Bianca hovered near Beatrice, already gathering scattered items from the rug while avoiding everyone else's eyes. The library that had felt like a courtroom when I arrived now looked like the wreckage of a failed empire. Forged documents lay beside shattered porcelain. My mother's $500 check was trapped beneath the leg of an antique chair. I did not pick it up. I stepped through the open doors and onto the stone patio. The rotor wash hit me immediately, cold and forceful, whipping my coat against my legs and pulling strands of hair free around my face. The black helicopter waited on the damaged lawn with its side door open. Preston fell into step beside me, carrying the briefcase again. Neither of us looked back at the house. Crossing the lawn felt strangely quiet despite the thunder of the blades. For years I had imagined what freedom from my family might feel like. I once thought it would require an apology, an admission that they had chosen Harrison over me, or some final moment when my parents realized they had been wrong. Walking toward the aircraft, I understood that none of those things were necessary. Their recognition had arrived too late to matter. I did not need them to understand me in order to leave them behind. Preston reached the helicopter first and steadied the door while I climbed inside. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and clean metal. I settled into the wide seat, fastened the belt, and placed my tablet on my lap. Preston took the seat across from me and pulled the door closed. The violent outside noise softened instantly. I put on the waiting headset and heard the pilot confirm that we were clear to depart. The helicopter lifted smoothly from the ruined lawn. The estate dropped away beneath us, shrinking with astonishing speed. Through the window, I saw the police vehicles near the front, drive officers moving across the property, Bianca standing near the patio, and the small figures of the people who had once seemed powerful enough to control my entire life. From the air, they looked exactly as they were, ordinary human beings, trapped inside consequences of their own making. I watched for only a few seconds. Then I turned away from the window. As we climbed higher, sunlight spread across the cabin and caught the edge of the tablet in my hands. I thought about the younger version of myself, who had once waited for praise at that same house, convinced that one perfect achievement might finally make me worthy of kindness. I wished I could tell her that the answer was never to become impressive enough for cruel people. The answer was to build a life in which their cruelty no longer had jurisdiction. My tablet awakened beneath my hand. A pending approval request waited at the top of the screen from the Apex Charitable Foundation. The proposal would fund a multi-million-dollar initiative providing cybersecurity education equipment and scholarships to young people building technical careers without family connections or financial support. I read the final summary once, reviewed the budget, and pressed approve. The confirmation appeared instantly. Below us, Greenwich receded into a patchwork of roads, trees, and expensive rooftops. I felt no triumphal need to keep staring at the house. Revenge had never been the helicopter, the foreclosure papers, or the stunned expression on Harrison's face. Those were consequences. The real victory was that none of them could decide what happened to me anymore. I leaned back in the leather seat as the aircraft turned toward the open blue horizon. The tension I had carried into the estate that morning finally left my shoulders. My phone remained silent in my coat pocket. I did not need another argument, another explanation, or another chance to be accepted. I had my company, my work, my future, and boundaries they could no longer cross. For the first time, leaving my childhood home did not feel like running away. It felt like ascending beyond it. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the steady rhythm of the rotors through the headset, completely free, entirely untouchable, and finally at peace. True power never comes from the family name you inherit or the approval of people who view you as a disposable asset. For decades, I believed my quiet nature made me weak and that my worth was defined by my parents' validation. I allowed them to cast me as the failure because it was easier than fighting their deeply flawed narrative. Surviving their emotional cruelty, however, taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. Financial and emotional independence is the ultimate armor. When you build your own foundation in the shadows entirely on your own terms, absolutely nobody can threaten to tear your roof down. You do not owe your loyalty or your future to toxic relatives who only claim you as family when they need a scapegoat or a financial savior. Walking away from abuse is not an act of betrayal, it is an act of fierce self-preservation. Sometimes the only way to heal is to let those who tried to destroy you face the ruin of their own making. Share your experiences in the comments below. If you have ever had to draw a hard line against toxic relatives who vastly underestimated your strength. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content about claiming your power. Thank you for listening, and always remember that your unbreakable boundaries are your greatest wealth.